My name is Aline Lerner. I run my own technical recruiting firm in the Bay Area, and you're watching Ask the Experts. I was a software engineer for about 5 years, and at the time I was working at a pretty small company. I think at its peak the eng team was about 5 people, and there wasn't really any kind of official recruiting or hiring operation, and as it turned out nobody else really wanted to deal with it, so I kind of just fell into that role organically because I thought it would be interesting. And it actually ended up being a lot more fulfilling than the engineering work I was doing, and over time I got this idea, and my boss actually said to me, when I start my own company, I want you to run my recruiting operation. At the time, I didn't even really realize it was a job, but then I looked into it a little bit more. I realized that not only is it a job, but there could be a very interesting niche for somebody who was technical and was doing recruiting. So I tried it out, and it actually ended up going very well. I ran recruiting in-house for about a year, and then I launched my own firm in January of 2013. And that brings us to present day. I think that there definitely is a gap between many recruiters and engineers because there's this absence of a common language. I think that a challenge for recruiters is really understanding what engineers do day to day and what makes an engineer good versus maybe mediocre. That's actually a very, very hard question that even with my engineering background, I don't have a good answer to, but I think that this is something that's especially hard for people who don't have a good grasp of what engineers are actually working on. I think that knowing how to code isn't necessarily a requirement for being a good recruiter, but I think maybe sitting with engineers, getting an idea of what they're working on, why it's important, why certain projects are more impactful than others would definitely go a really long way. Well, I think that recruiting engineers is hard not just for recruiters, but for other engineers, for CEOs, founders, CTOs, everybody. I think that it's just a hard problem in general. I don't know that there's necessarily a magic bullet for recruiting. I think that there are a few things that I've noticed that have made my life a little bit easier, and maybe those things are generalizable. When possible, in outgoing messaging, go personal. Sometimes it can be very hard to go personal because the person you're trying to target doesn't have a lot of information available online. But if that information is available, then make an effort and take a look and really ask yourself, why do I want to contact this person? And if you can't formulate a good answer in your head about why you're reaching out to them, perhaps beyond the fact that they have a good pedigree, then maybe rethink that and try to tie in what the company that you're recruiting for is doing to what people have done in the past, and draw that link and say, well, you've done this and it's really interesting and we're doing this other thing, and here's the bridge between what you're doing now and what you might be doing with us. So personal is one big thing. Outside of that, I think working on a strong engineering brand, especially if you're in-house, is extremely important. When you reach out to people, generally, unless your brand is a household name brand, the reach out is going to be cold. If there's any way to maximize the amount of warm reach outs that you can have, i.e. the people that you're reaching out to already know what you do and respect it, then you're going to have a much easier time of it. I think until your company is in that position, you're going to be fighting really, really hard for every single hire, and every single hire is going to be a one-off. But if you get to the point where your brand is recognizable, and even better if your engineering brand is recognizable, in other words, you're known for doing really cool stuff, solving really hard problems, then all of a sudden your hiring operation can scale. If you do have a strong brand, then in some sense you have this luxury where you don't have to go as personal as you would have otherwise. If Google reaches out to you, you're an engineer, at some point in your career you're going to respond. I know when I first got my email from a Google recruiter, wow, right? And I think a lot of people feel that way. So if you can't quite elicit that wow reaction with just your name brand alone, then try to really engage people and talk about what they're doing and what you're doing, and explain in a pithy way. You don't want to rant, just why what you're doing is important. There are certain industries, I think, that have an easier time of this than others. If you're doing education, then people tend to respond very well. If you're doing advertising, then maybe it's a little harder, but advertising also has a lot of interesting aspects because you're dealing with these huge volumes of data. And probably there are going to be people on your team that are very, very strong, and then maybe you want to lead with that. But every organization has something about them that's special, and you have to zero in on what that thing is, and then kind of standardize that messaging as much as you can and just send that out into the world. Maybe you're just sending it out in recruiting emails, but if you attend meetups, if your engineers talk to other engineers, come up with some kind of succinct value prop that you can share, and I think that'll help. So this is something I actually think about a lot. Like, does the fact that I know how to code give me this huge edge over other recruiters? And I don't think it necessarily does. I think that people tend to trust me more at the outset because I can get a little more granular in my discussions with them about work, and maybe I can gauge their skills better than somebody who hasn't coded. But that's all at the top of the funnel, right? So once you do get somebody in the door, I think it's an entirely different skill set, right? Recruiting is, I think, a glorified sales job in a lot of ways, and you have to be a good salesperson. If you're an in-house recruiter, you have to be excited about what your company is doing, and that excitement has to just leap off the page when you're writing and has to be palpable when you're speaking to somebody. If you're a third-party recruiter and you're representing other companies, then you have to get very, very good at selling, and you have to get very, very good at closing, and that involves following up, making sure that nobody drops off. A lot of these are standard CRM challenges that carry over from sales. And there, actually, I don't think I'm nearly as good as a lot of other recruiters. So in some sense, I do have a bit of an edge, but in other ways, not at all. So it's a very multifaceted job, and it involves a lot of different aspects. So I think my views on this are a little bit non-traditional, but I know that the standard recruiting wisdom says that you should find people while they're still passive, forge this long-term relationship with them, and then the idea is that on the day when their proverbial light goes on and all of a sudden they become an active candidate, you're going to be the first person they call. That's very nice, but I don't think that scales. I think that a big problem in recruiting in general is this information asymmetry. So if I'm a candidate and I know I want a job in a certain industry, how do I get information about how much I'm going to get paid, about what companies are working in that industry beyond my network and beyond companies that are really famous? How do I know what people I'm going to work with and what projects I'm going to work on? None of that information is easily available, and in some sense recruiters are the gatekeepers of this information if they're good at their jobs. But I would like to see a change in this industry where in the moment that a candidate decides they're looking for work, there's some way for them to get access to this information without relying on brittle personal relationships. But in the status quo where that doesn't exist, I think that recruiters should be able to offer value to candidates upfront. So even if you are passive, let me tell you about some companies that you may not have heard of otherwise that are doing cool things, right? Let me tell you a little bit about salary trends. Let me tell you about what languages and frameworks are popular. Let me hook you up with mock interviews, give you ways to practice so that when you do go out there, you're ready. Let me introduce you to people in any number of companies and just have you talk to them in a non-committal way about what it's like to work there and what they're doing. So just offer value by attacking this information asymmetry and giving people insights that they probably would not have otherwise. That's probably the best way to win their trust. And then when they do look, odds are they will come to you. Yes and no. I think that it depends how deep you go, right? I think that getting a little bit of experience, just writing some very simple programs, getting enough of a mental model of what's going on, so you know what the difference is between a client and a server, back end and front end, understanding what a database is. I think that stuff is invaluable, because until you understand that, you can't effectively sell the company or companies that you're representing. Until you know that stuff, you're just a parrot and you're saying words, and you're not going to be able to engage with your audience as well as if you actually have some idea of what those words mean. But I think there are diminishing returns. I think that if you can get past that initial hurdle and just get enough information to have an intuitive understanding of what companies do and how that fits into this greater whole, then you're probably going to be set. You don't really need to, I mean, I imagine some people, once they start, will be really engaged and want to keep going, and that's fantastic. But I think that once you get over that first hump, additional knowledge will not help you as much. That's my guess. There's a really good book by a guy named Tommy Chang called The Non-Technical Guide to Web Technologies, and that book actually gives a fantastic overview of the web stack and kind of how the internet works. And then it also places various name brands that you've heard and companies that you may even have worked with into this hierarchy and into this picture. So it's really, really useful. Another resource, a little biased because I used to run hiring for them, but Udacity has a series of fantastic courses. I would recommend something called CS 101. Which is a very introductory guide to programming. You'll learn a little bit about Python and a little bit about how the internet works. And then if you want to go a little bit deeper after that, there's a class called CS 253, which I think is called Introduction to Web Development. So between those two, you'll probably be in really good shape. And a shameless plug, if I may, a friend of mine who's a fantastic engineer and I teamed up to actually create a series called Tech for Tech Recruiters. We had a pilot of that a few months ago, and it was really successful, so we'll be rolling out more sessions in the hopefully near future. And the idea there is that we'll be talking about web stack, again, how the internet works, and then bringing in other engineers who are experts in different domains, like front-end engineers, back-end, data scientists, people who do NLP and computational linguistics, and explaining how what they do fits into this bigger picture, and also talking about good ways to approach people in their disciplines, and maybe even good ways to filter candidates that work on these specific things.